Before we begin, a word of caution. This is not history for the faint of heart. What you are about to hear contains documented accounts of child abuse, psychological torture, and the deliberate destruction of a young life. The events described are historically verified and presented without embellishment, but that makes them no less disturbing. If you are sensitive to such content, particularly involving the suffering of children, please consider carefully before continuing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Picture this. The year is 1795. In the heart of Paris, within the medieval walls of a fortress called the Temple, a doctor forces open a door that hasn't been unlocked in 6 months. The smell hits first. Human waste, rot, the unmistakable sweetness of infection. In the darkness, on a cot that has not been changed since winter, lies something barely recognizable as human, a child, perhaps 10 years old. His body is covered in tumors and open sores. His legs, swollen and bent at unnatural angles, have not supported his weight in months. He is caked in his own filth, lying in the same position he was left in half a year ago. He does not speak when the doctor enters. He does not look up. He has forgotten how to do either. He will be dead within 3 days. 2 years earlier, this same child had been the Dauphin of France, heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. He had been dressed in silk, surrounded by servants, adored by his mother, destined to rule as Louis XVI. He had golden curls, large blue eyes, and a smile that charmed everyone who met him. He played in the gardens of Versailles. He learned Latin from his father, the king. He called his mother Chaud d'amour, my little cabbage of love, and she called him the same in return. What happened in between is not merely tragedy. It is not simply the collateral damage of revolution. It is one of history's most methodical, deliberate destructions of a human being. A systematic campaign to annihilate a child's mind, body, and soul, carried out by adults who believed they were creating a better world. This is not a story about the French Revolution's grand ideals. Tonight, we strip away the rhetoric of liberty and equality, and we look at what those ideals meant when applied to a 7-year-old boy. We examine what happens when ideology decides a child is not a child, but a symbol that must be broken, a symbol that must be erased, a symbol that must be made to suffer for the sins of his bloodline. Tonight, we descend into the Temple prison. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely find value in these journeys into the past. And do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always a privilege to know who is joining us from around the world. The story of Louis Charles, the boy who would briefly be called Louis XVI, is not well known outside France. His parents, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, cast such long shadows that their children have been largely forgotten. We remember the guillotine. We remember, let them eat cake. Words Marie Antoinette never actually said. We remember the revolution as a great upheaval, a turning point in human history. We do not remember what happened to their son. We do not remember the room where a child was left to rot alive. We do not remember the men who made an 8-year-old denounce his own mother. We do not remember the silence that fell over the Temple. The months when no one spoke to him, no one touched him, no one acknowledged that he was still alive. Perhaps we do not want to remember. Perhaps it is easier to let this child remain a footnote, a casualty of larger forces, a regrettable but inevitable consequence of revolutionary fervor. But he was not a footnote. He was a boy. He had a name. He suffered in ways that should never be forgotten. Tonight, we remember. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand how Louis Charles came to die in a prison cell, we must first understand the world he was born into, a world of unimaginable privilege, of ritualized splendor, of a court so removed from ordinary life that it had become its own reality. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a universe unto itself, with its own laws, its own rhythms, its own ways of seeing and being seen. Into this golden cage, on March 27, 1785, a child was born who would never be allowed to simply be a child. Louis Charles was the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. His arrival was celebrated throughout France, cannons fired, church bells rang, and the nation rejoiced at another heir to the Bourbon dynasty. But in truth, his birth was something of a relief for other reasons. The royal couple had struggled for years to produce children. Their marriage, arranged when they were teenagers, had remained unconsummated for 7 agonizing years, the subject of constant gossip and diplomatic concern. When children finally came, first a daughter, Marie-Thérèse, in 1778, then a son, Louis-Joseph, in 1781, it quieted the whispers. The birth of a second son in 1785 seemed to cement the dynasty's future. Louis Charles was not born to be king. His older brother, Louis-Joseph, held that destiny. This meant that the younger prince was, in some ways, freer than his sickly sibling. While Louis-Joseph was subjected to the rigorous formality demanded of a future monarch, Louis Charles was allowed to be more himself, playful, affectionate, curious. Contemporary accounts describe him as an exceptionally charming child. He had his mother's fair coloring and his father's gentle disposition. He laughed easily, spoke precociously, and won the hearts of nearly everyone who encountered him. But let us not romanticize this childhood, even before the Revolution shattered it. Life at Versailles, even for a beloved prince, was strange and artificial in ways that are difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. From birth, Louis Charles was public property. His infancy was witnessed by crowds of courtiers. The births of royal children were essentially public events, with dozens of onlookers present to verify the legitimacy of the delivery. He was handed from wet nurse to governess to tutor, each transition governed by rigid protocol. He saw his mother for carefully scheduled hours. He learned before he could fully understand that he was not an individual, but a role, a position, a piece in a vast dynastic game. Marie Antoinette, despite the constraints of her position, appears to have genuinely loved her children, and Louis Charles especially. She called him chat d'amour, a term of endearment that might translate as love cabbage or darling dumpling, a pet name that captures something of the intimacy she sought with him. She insisted on being more involved in his upbringing than protocol typically allowed. She dressed him herself when she could. She played with him in the gardens of the Petit Trianon, her private retreat from the suffocating formality of the main palace. In her letters, she writes of him with unmistakable tenderness, his cleverness, his sweetness, his easy affection. His father, Louis XVI, was a more distant figure, as royal fathers generally were. The king was an awkward man, more comfortable with locks and maps than with people. He was intelligent, but indecisive, well-meaning, but weak, a man singularly unsuited to the throne he had inherited and the crisis that was bearing down upon him. But he too showed affection for his younger son, teaching him geography and history, sharing with him the mechanical interests that were the king's true passion. In another life, Louis XVI might have been a happy watchmaker. Instead, he was a king who could not stop the world from crashing down around his family. In 1789, when Louis Charles was 4 years old, his older brother died of tuberculosis. The sickly Louis Joseph, who had never been strong, finally succumbed to the disease that had been consuming him for years. For the royal family, it was a private tragedy. For the nation, it meant something else entirely. Louis Charles was now the Dauphin, the heir to the throne of France. The carefree second son was suddenly the most important child in the kingdom. He was 4 years old. He did not understand what had changed. He only knew that his brother was gone, that his mother wept, that suddenly everyone looked at him differently. The weight of a 1,000-year dynasty had settled on shoulders too small to bear it. And outside the golden gates of Versailles, France was beginning to burn. To comprehend what happened to Louis Charles, we must first understand, at least briefly, the world that was collapsing around him. The French Revolution did not emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of crisis. Financial, political, social, intellectual, that the monarchy had proven utterly unable to address. France, in the 1780s, was a nation of profound contradictions. It was the most powerful country in Europe, with the largest population and the most sophisticated culture. French was the language of diplomacy and enlightenment. French philosophers were reshaping how humanity understood itself. French armies had helped the American colonies win their independence from Britain, and yet the French state was bankrupt, its treasury emptied by wars and extravagance, its tax system so riddled with exemptions for the privileged that it could not generate sufficient revenue, its people increasingly desperate. The harvest failures of 1788 pushed the countryside to the brink of famine. Bread prices soared. Peasants who had always been poor now faced actual starvation. In Paris, the urban poor, workers, artisans, the vast underclass that kept the city functioning, watched their meager wages become worthless as food costs consumed everything. And above them, visible and resented, the aristocracy continued to live in splendor. The church continued to hoard its wealth, and the queen continued to be blamed for every extravagance, real or imagined. Marie Antoinette had become, by 1789, the most hated woman in France. It was not entirely fair. She was extravagant, yes, but no more so than queens before her. She was Austrian by birth, which made her a convenient target for xenophobic rage. She was beautiful and proud, which made her an easy symbol of aristocratic arrogance. And she was a woman with influence, which made her threatening in ways that were never quite articulated but always felt. The pamphlets that circulated about her were vicious beyond anything we might expect. They accused her of sexual depravity, affairs with men and women, orgies, incest. They accused her of bankrupting France to fund her pleasures. They called her Madame Deficit, as if she personally had emptied the treasury. None of this was true in any meaningful sense, but truth had long since ceased to matter. Marie Antoinette had become a symbol, and symbols are not required to be accurate. The little Dauphin, playing in the gardens of Versailles, knew nothing of this. He did not know that his mother was hated. He did not know that his father's government was collapsing. He did not know that pamphleteers were imagining his family's deaths in graphic detail. He knew only the world he could see, the golden rooms, the manicured gardens, his mother's embrace, the solemn rituals of court life that must have seemed to a child simply the way things were. On July 14, 1789, a Parisian mob stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress that had become a symbol of royal tyranny. The actual prison held only 7 inmates at the time, but that was beside the point. The Bastille represented something, and by tearing it down, the people of Paris were announcing that the old order was finished. The governor of the prison was killed, his head paraded through the streets on a pike, the first of many heads. When news reached Versailles, the king famously asked, "Is it a revolt?" The Duc de la Rochefoucauld, Liancourt replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." Louis Charles was 4 years old. He did not know what a revolution was. He would learn. The revolution came to Versailles on October 5, 1789, in the form of thousands of women marching from Paris. They were hungry, they were furious, they wanted bread, and they wanted the royal family to return to Paris, where they could be watched, where they could be held accountable, where they could not escape. What happened that night and the following morning remains one of the most terrifying episodes of the revolution's early phase. The mob surrounded the palace. They broke through the gates. They surged into the corridors, searching for the queen, screaming for her blood. Marie Antoinette, awakened by the commotion, fled her bedchamber moments before the crowd burst in. Guards were killed. Their heads were severed and mounted on pikes. The violence was chaotic, personal, fueled by years of accumulated rage. Louis Charles was 4 years old. He was awakened in the night by screaming. He was carried through darkened corridors by terrified servants. He saw things no child should see. And when dawn came, his family was forced onto a balcony to face the mob below, to prove they were still alive, to submit to the will of the people who had nearly killed them hours before. Later that day, the royal family was escorted to Paris. The journey took hours. The royal carriage, surrounded by the crowd, by the National Guard, by the heads of murdered guards still mounted on their pikes. Some in the mob carried loaves of bread, shouting that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to Paris. But not too young to feel the terror, to sense that the world he knew was ending. They would never return to Versailles. For the next 2 years, the royal family lived in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. It was a strange existence, technically still royal, theoretically still reigning, but effectively prisoners. The king went through the motions of constitutional monarchy, signing decrees he despised, wearing the revolutionary cockade he loathed, pretending to accept a new order he hoped would somehow collapse. The Dauphin continued his education during these years. He was taught by his father, by tutors who remained loyal. He played in the palace gardens, though now under the watchful eyes of National Guard sentries. He grew from a toddler into a young boy, precocious and observant, increasingly aware that something was terribly wrong with his world, but still too young to fully grasp what it was. In June 1791, the family made their desperate bid for freedom. And then the terrible recognition, the capture, the humiliating journey back to Paris. Louis Charles, now 6 years old, experienced this as a terrifying adventure. He spent 3 days in a cramped carriage surrounded by hostile crowds at every stop. People pressed against the windows, screaming at his parents, jeering, threatening. He saw his mother and father forced to endure insult after insult without responding. He learned in those 3 days that his family was hated, that the world wanted them dead. When they returned to Paris, whatever pretense of normal monarchy remained was gone. The king was suspended from his functions, then eventually restored, but everyone knew the truth. The royal family was trapped. It was only a matter of time before something worse happened. That something came on August 10, 1792. A mob, far larger and more violent than any before, stormed the Tuileries. The Swiss Guard, 600 men sworn to protect the king, fought to the last. The royal family, having fled to the nearby Legislative Assembly for protection, listened to the sounds of massacre outside. They sat in a small box normally reserved for journalists, cramped and terrified as legislators debated their fate. The Dauphin, 7 years old, pressed against his mother. He did not cry. He had learned by now not to cry. That night, the Assembly voted to suspend the monarchy. The royal family was transferred to the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris that would become their final prison. They arrived after dark, passing through streets lined with people celebrating their downfall. Louis Charles would never know freedom again. He had 7 years left to live. Built in the 13th century as the Paris headquarters of the Knights Templar, it had stood for 500 years as a medieval fortress, incongruously preserved in the heart of a modern city. After the Templar suppression, it had passed through various hands, eventually becoming property of the Count of Artois, the king's younger brother. It was never meant to be a prison, but in August 1792, as the revolution consumed the old order, the revolutionaries founded a convenient place to store what remained of the French monarchy. The complex consisted of several buildings, but the royal family was held in the Grand Tower, a massive stone keep that rose 100 feet above the surrounding streets. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, its atmosphere oppressive even in summer. Here, in rooms that had never been designed for habitation, the former rulers of France would spend their final months together. In the first weeks, the conditions were not as terrible as what would come later. The family was allowed to live together, occupying several floors of the tower. They had servants, though their numbers dwindled as the months passed. They had furniture, brought from the Tuileries. They had books, games, the materials for needlework. The king was permitted to teach his son, to continue the lessons in history and geography and Latin that had always been part of their routine. Marie Antoinette and her daughter, Marie Therese, now 14, worked on embroidery together. They tried desperately to maintain some semblance of normal family life. The king had always been most himself in private, away from the crushing formality of court life. In the temple, stripped of his throne and his duties, he became simply a father and husband. He played games with his children. He read aloud to his family. He taught Louis Charles to memorize passages from Corneille and Racine. There are accounts of genuine happiness in these early months, moments when the family laughed together, when the children played, when the adults allowed themselves to forget, briefly, that they were prisoners awaiting an uncertain fate. But they could never forget for long. The reminders were constant and calculated. Guards were stationed throughout the tower, men who had been chosen specifically for their revolutionary fervor and their lack of sympathy for the prisoners. They were under orders to show no deference, to treat the former monarchs as ordinary citizens, or rather as criminals awaiting judgment. They blew tobacco smoke in the king's face. They sang revolutionary songs at all hours, the crude verses carrying clearly through the stone walls. They kept their hats on in the Queen's presence, a deliberate insult that would have been unthinkable months before. They searched the family's rooms repeatedly, often at night, looking for hidden messages or weapons that did not exist. The royal family was forbidden from speaking privately. Every conversation was monitored. Letters were read, edited, often confiscated entirely. Visitors were rare and closely supervised. The children could not play outside without guards, watching their every movement. The windows were barred and eventually boarded, so that the prisoners could neither see out nor be seen by royalist sympathizers who might gather below. And always, always, there was the uncertainty. The family did not know what would happen to them. The Legislative Assembly had given way to the National Convention, more radical, more bloodthirsty. The September massacres, a days-long orgy of violence in which mobs murdered over 1,000 prisoners in Paris, demonstrated just how quickly events could spiral into chaos. The royal family heard the screams from their tower. They knew that their own lives hung by the thinnest of threads. One moment from this period haunts the historical record. In early September 1792, a mob that had been slaughtering prisoners at the nearby La Force prison decided to bring a special trophy to the temple. They carried the head of the Princesse de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's closest friend, mounted on a pike. They demanded that the queen be brought to the window to kiss her friend's severed lips. The officials at the temple managed to prevent this final obscenity, but not before the queen glimpsed the procession from her window. She fainted. When she recovered, she found her children clinging to her daughter sobbing, her son pale and silent. Louis Charles was 7 years old. He had just seen the mutilated remains of a woman he had known his entire life. How do you explain such things to a child? What do you say to make sense of a world where people carry heads through the streets, where your friends can be torn apart by mobs, where the crowds outside your window chant for your family's death? The historical record does not tell us what Marie Antoinette said to her son that night. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Perhaps she simply held him as mothers hold children when the world has become too terrible for words. The autumn of 1792 passed in this dreadful limbo. The family clung to each other, to their routines, to whatever scraps of normalcy they could maintain. The king taught his son. The queen and her daughter sewed. They read, they prayed, they waited. Outside, the revolution was devouring itself and everyone around it. But inside the temple, time seemed to have stopped. In December, the waiting ended. The National Convention put Louis XVI on trial for treason. The trial was, in many ways, a formality. The outcome was never seriously in doubt. The king was accused of conspiring with foreign powers, of betraying the nation, of attempting to flee his responsibilities. The evidence was selectively presented, the defense constrained, the verdict predetermined. What mattered was not justice, but symbolism. The Republic needed to demonstrate, conclusively and irrevocably, that the age of kings was over. Louis XVI conducted himself with more dignity in the courtroom than he had ever shown on the throne. He was calm, measured, even eloquent at times. He denied the charges, not by claiming innocence, but by questioning the convention's authority to judge him. He knew he was going to die. He had known it for months. All that remained was to die well. On January 20th, 1793, the convention voted. The king was condemned to death, the sentence to be carried out the next day. There would be no appeal, no delay, no possibility of reprieve. That evening, Louis XVI was permitted a final visit with his family. The scene that followed has been described by multiple witnesses, and though accounts vary in details, they agree on the essentials. It was, by any measure, one of the most heartbreaking moments of the Revolution. Marie Antoinette, who had been separated from her husband for weeks, embraced him. Their daughter wept openly, and Louis Charles, 8 years old, clung to his father's legs, begging him not to leave. The king tried to comfort them. He promised Marie Antoinette that he would see her again the next morning, before his execution, so they could say a proper goodbye. He extracted promises from his children to be brave, to care for their mother, to forgive those who were about to kill him. He held his son, this little boy who now bore the terrible title of King of France, and tried to prepare him for a future neither of them could imagine. When the guards finally separated them, Marie Antoinette had to be physically restrained from following her husband. Her screams echoed through the tower. Louis Charles watched his father walk away, disappearing down the stone corridor. He had been promised a final goodbye in the morning. That promise was not kept. The revolutionaries decided it would be too dangerous, too likely to provoke sympathy or resistance. When dawn came, Louis XVI was taken directly to the scaffold, without seeing his family again. The last words his son ever heard from him were the promises of the night before, promises that were already lies. On January 21, 793, at 10:22 in the morning, Louis XVI was guillotined in the Place de la Révolution. A cannon was fired to announce the execution. The sound reached the temple, where Marie Antoinette and her children waited in an agony of suspense. When the queen heard the cannon, she knew. She collapsed. Her children surrounded her, crying. Louis Charles, confused and terrified, kept asking when his father would come back, when they would see him again. No one could bring themselves to tell him the truth. In the eyes of royalists across Europe, Louis Charles was now Louis XVI, King of France. In the eyes of the Republic, he was something far more dangerous, a living symbol around which counter-revolution could rally, a pretender whose very existence threatened the new order. The revolutionaries had killed the king. Now they had to decide what to do with his son. They began to plan something far worse than death. The months that followed Louis XVI's execution were a strange twilight for the remaining prisoners. Marie Antoinette, now simply the widow Capet in official documents, was still permitted to live with her children. They still had their routines, their lessons, their carefully constructed normalcy. But everything had changed. The queen, always resilient, seemed to age decades in weeks. Her hair, already graying, turned completely white. She spent hours staring at nothing, lost in a grief she could not afford to fully express. Louis Charles tried to fill the void his father had left. He was 8 years old, suddenly the man of his diminished family. He tried to be brave, as his father had asked. He comforted his mother when she wept. He played games with his sister to distract her from their circumstances. In the accounts that survive from this period, he emerges as a child of remarkable sensitivity and grace, struggling to make sense of an impossible situation. But the revolutionaries were watching. The Committee of Public Safety, the body that increasingly controlled the terror, had decided that the young Capet they refused to use his royal titles posed an unacceptable risk. As long as he remained with his mother, he would be raised to remember who he was, to believe in his birthright, to dream of restoration. He had to be separated. He had to be re-educated. He had to be transformed from a prince into a good citizen of the Republic. On July 3, 1793, at 10 o'clock at night, officials came to the temple to take Louis Charles away from his family. What happened next has been documented by multiple witnesses, including Marie-Thérèse, who survived to write about it decades later. It remains one of the most harrowing scenes of the Revolution, not because of physical violence, which was minimal, but because of the psychological cruelty inflicted on a mother and child in the name of ideology. The officials announced that Louis Charles was to be removed from his mother's care and placed in separate quarters within the temple, under the supervision of a guardian appointed by the government. Marie Antoinette refused. She placed herself physically in front of her son, daring them to use force. For more than an hour she argued, pleaded, demanded to know under what authority they acted. The officials grew impatient. They threatened to kill Marie-Thérèse if the queen did not cooperate. They made clear that they would take the boy regardless, and that resistance would only bring greater suffering on everyone. Finally, after an hour of this psychological torture, Marie Antoinette surrendered. The actual separation was terrible beyond description. Louis Charles clung to his mother, sobbing, begging not to be taken. She held him, kissed him, tried to find words of comfort. Marie-Therese wept. The guards stood by, unmoved, waiting. Finally, Marie Antoinette released her son. She made him promise to be good, to remember everything his father had taught him, to never forget who he was. She kissed him one last time, and then the guards took him away. He was 8 years old. He was screaming. He called for his mother as they dragged him down the stairs to the floor below. She could hear him crying through the stone ceiling, and she was not allowed to go to him. She would never see him again. She would never hold him again. Louis Charles was taken to a room on the floor below his mother's quarters, close enough that she could hear him, sometimes, through the floor. Far enough that she could not reach him, could not comfort him, could not protect him from what was about to happen. The Revolution had assigned him a new guardian, a man named Antoine Simon. Simon was a cobbler by trade, an ardent revolutionary by conviction. He was coarse, uneducated, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He had been selected for this duty precisely because he had no sympathy for royalty, no tender feelings that might complicate his mission. His job was simple: take the Dauphin and transform him into a sans-culotte, a good Republican, a living repudiation of everything his family represented. The process began immediately. Simon understood in his crude way that he was dealing with a child whose identity had been formed by years of royal conditioning. The boy thought of himself as a prince, as the son of a king, as heir to a sacred bloodline. All of this had to be destroyed. The child's self-conception had to be broken down and rebuilt from the ground up. He had to be made to hate everything he had been taught to love. The methods Simon employed were systematic and brutal. He beat Louis Charles regularly. Not the measured discipline that even loving parents of the era employed, but savage beatings intended to terrorize and subjugate. He screamed at the boy constantly, mocking his upbringing, his parents, his former life. He forced him to wear a red revolutionary cap, the symbol of the sans-culotte, and to address everyone as citizen in the revolutionary manner. He made the child drink alcohol. This detail appears repeatedly in the historical sources, and its cruelty is difficult to overstate. Simon gave wine and brandy to an 8-year-old, encouraging him to drink to excess, finding amusement in the boy's intoxication. Whether this was meant to sedate him, to corrupt him, or simply to degrade him is unclear. The result was an 8-year-old who became dependent on alcohol, who was drunk much of the time, whose developing brain was being poisoned even as his spirit was being broken. Simon taught him to curse. This, too, was deliberate, a calculated assault on everything the boy had been raised to be. Louis Charles, who had been taught courtly manners from birth, was now forced to use the crudest language imaginable. He was rewarded when he cursed effectively, punished when he slipped back into politeness. He learned to call his mother the Austrian whore. He learned revolutionary songs, including La Carmagnole, whose verses celebrated the imprisonment of the royal family. He was made to sing these songs repeatedly to demonstrate his transformation. Can we even begin to imagine what this was like for the child? He had been taught his entire life that his mother was the most important woman in the world, that his father was God's anointed representative, that his family was sacred. Now he was being forced to denounce everything he knew, to profane everything he loved, to become the opposite of what he had been. The cognitive dissonance alone would have been devastating for an adult. For an 8-year-old, it was a form of psychological destruction. Some accounts suggest that Simon's wife, Marie-Jeanne, showed the boy moments of kindness. She reportedly intervened sometimes when her husband's cruelty went too far. She may have provided small comforts, a gentle word, a moment of respite. If so, these kindnesses were exceptions that only highlighted the horror of his daily existence. Visitors to the temple during this period reported seeing a transformed child. Gone was the charming, affectionate boy who had delighted everyone who met him. In his place was something else. A creature who mechanically recited revolutionary slogans, who cursed fluently, who flinched at sudden movements, who had the dead eyes of someone who has learned that survival requires complete submission. Sometimes, when Simon wasn't watching, he would break down and cry for his mother. These moments were becoming rarer. The most terrible thing Simon did was not the beatings, not the alcohol, not even the psychological abuse. The most terrible thing was what he forced Louis Charles to do to his own mother. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was put on trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The charges against her were extensive: treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, depleting the national treasury, debauchery at Versailles. Most were exaggerations or outright lies, but the truth was irrelevant. The tribunal existed to condemn, not to judge. But the revolutionaries wanted something more than a conviction. They wanted to utterly destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation, to make her into a monster so vile that no one could sympathize with her. And they had a weapon: her own son. Louis Charles was brought before the revolutionary prosecutor, Jacques Hebert, a man known for his violent rhetoric and his hatred of the royal family. Under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear, whether through coercion, intimidation, or the confused compliance of an abused child, Louis Charles signed a statement making horrific accusations against his mother. The statement accused Marie Antoinette and her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, of unspeakable crimes against him. The specific nature of these accusations is too vile to repeat here. But they alleged the worst forms of abuse a mother could inflict upon a child. The charges were fabricated, obscene, and designed to shock. Accusations so monstrous that even speaking them aloud would damn the Queen in the eyes of the public. We cannot know exactly how this statement was obtained. Louis Charles was 8 years old, traumatized, likely intoxicated, certainly terrified. He may not have fully understood what he was signing. He may have been beaten into compliance. He may have simply said whatever his tormentors wanted him to say, the survival instinct overriding everything else. What we know is that his signature, or what passed for it, appeared on a document accusing his mother of crimes no child should ever have to imagine, let alone speak. The accusation was read aloud at Marie Antoinette's trial. The effect in the courtroom was profound, but not in the way the revolutionaries had intended. The accusation was so patently absurd, so clearly the product of fabrication or coercion, that it backfired. When asked to respond, Marie Antoinette delivered one of the Revolution's most memorable moments. She paused. She looked around the courtroom, and then she said, "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all the mothers here present." It had revealed the prosecution's viciousness rather than the Queen's guilt. But for Louis Charles, this moment of his mother's dignity came at an unbearable cost. He had been made to condemn her. Whether he understood what he was doing, whether he was capable of understanding, the fact remained. He had been used as a weapon against the mother who loved him. Marie Antoinette was convicted and sentenced to death. On October 16, 1793, she was guillotined, her hair shorn, her hands bound, transported to the scaffold in an open cart while crowds jeered. She conducted herself with dignity to the end, famously apologizing to the executioner when she accidentally stepped on his foot. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." She was 37 years old. She died not knowing what had become of her son, only that he had been taken from her, that he had been turned against her, that the last thing she knew of him was his voice denouncing her in court. Louis Charles was not told of his mother's death. In the room below where she had lived, in the tower where he could sometimes hear her footsteps overhead, he was left to wonder what had happened to her. Eventually, he must have understood. The footsteps stopped. The guards made cruel jokes about the Austrian whore. He was alone now. He was alone now. Truly alone now. No father, no family, just Simon and the bottle, and the endless lessons in how to be someone he was not. And even this terrible existence was about to get worse. In January 1794, Antoine Simon was reassigned. He left the temple to take up other revolutionary duties, leaving his young charge behind. What replaced Simon was not a better guardian or a worse one. What replaced him was nothing at all. After Simon's departure, the Committee of Public Safety made a decision about Louis Charles that defies easy comprehension. They did not assign him a new guardian. They did not arrange for his care. They did not even arrange for his death, which would have been merciful by comparison to what they actually did. They simply left him. The child was confined to a single room in the temple tower. The door was locked. A grate was installed through which food could be passed without the door being opened. And then, for approximately 6 months, almost no one entered that room. Let that sink in. An 8-year-old child, already traumatized beyond imagining, was locked in a room and abandoned. No one came to clean him or his chamber. No one came to talk to him. No one came to check on his physical or mental condition. Food was shoved through a grate by guards who were under orders not to communicate with him. His chamber pot overflowed and was not emptied. His bedding, soiled, was not changed. His clothes, outgrown and filthy, were not replaced. He was not a prisoner. A prisoner would have received more care than this. He was something else. Something the revolutionary government did not have a word for. He was an inconvenience being erased through neglect, a symbol being destroyed through abandonment, a child being unmade by the simple withdrawal of everything that makes a child human. What happens to a child in such circumstances? Modern psychology has documented the effects of extreme isolation, and they are devastating even for adults. For children whose brains are still developing, whose sense of self is still forming, prolonged isolation causes damage that can never be fully repaired. In the first days and weeks, there would have been terror. Louis Charles would have cried, screamed, begged for someone to come. He would have pounded on the door until his fists were bloody. He would have called for his mother, his sister, anyone. No one came. After a while, the screaming would have stopped, not because the terror faded, but because he learned that screaming brought no response. He was using energy he could not afford to waste. He was speaking to walls that would never answer. Then would come a different kind of suffering. The slow dissolution of self that occurs when a human being is deprived of all human contact. We are social creatures. We exist in relation to others. A child who sees no faces, hears no voices, receives no touch, begins to lose the ability to imagine that others exist at all. The boundary between self and world, which is always somewhat fluid in children, begins to collapse. Reality becomes meaningless. Time becomes meaningless. The child retreats into himself. And what he finds there, alone in the dark, is not comforting. Louis Charles would have stopped speaking. Language is a social skill. Without anyone to speak to, it atrophies with terrifying speed in children. He would have stopped moving normally. Physical development requires stimulation, activity, engagement with the environment. Confined to a small room, he would have lost muscle tone, coordination, the basic physical capacities that children develop through play. He would have developed rickets. This disease, caused by vitamin D deficiency, warps growing bones. In a room with boarded windows, receiving no sunlight for months, Louis Charles's legs would have begun to bend, his joints to swell, his bones to soften. He would have lost the ability to walk, then to stand, then to move from his bed at all. And through all of this, he was lying in his own waste. The chamber pot overflowed. The guards who passed food through the grate did not enter to empty it. The smell would have been unbearable. The child would have developed sores, infections, the beginning of the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. He was rotting alive in a room in the middle of Paris. We do not know what he thought during these months. We cannot know. The child who emerged from this ordeal was not capable of describing it, and no one thought to ask. We can only imagine the darkness, the silence, the gradual fading of everything that had made him a person. Did he dream of his mother? Did he remember Versailles, the gardens, the golden rooms? Did he still know who he was? Or had that knowledge been erased along with everything else? Did he still pray as his parents had taught him, or had God abandoned him along with everyone else? The revolutionaries who ordered this abandonment never explained their reasoning. Perhaps they hoped he would simply die, solving the problem of what to do with a living symbol of the old regime. Perhaps they did not think about him at all. The machinery of the terror was consuming their attention, the daily executions, the constant fear of counter-revolution. Perhaps they convinced themselves that what they were doing was not really happening, that the child in the locked room was not really a child, that symbols do not suffer. But he was a child. He did suffer. And in the darkness of that room, over 6 months of abandonment, the boy who had been Louis Charles ceased to exist. What remained was something else. A damaged creature, barely human. The man who was a child in the temple, waiting for an end that would not come quickly. In July 1794, the Thermidorian reaction brought down Robespierre and ended the most radical phase of the revolution. The men who took power were horrified by the excesses of the terror. They wanted to distance themselves from the bloodshed, to present themselves as moderates. And eventually, someone remembered the child in the temple. When officials finally entered Louis Charles's room, what they found shocked even men who had seen the worst of the terror. The room was a cesspit. Feces and urine covered the floor. The stench was so overwhelming that some of the officials could not remain inside. In the midst of this horror, on a bed that had not been changed in half a year, lay a child. He was unrecognizable. His body was covered in sores and tumors. His legs, warped by rickets, were bent and swollen. He was caked in filth so thick that his features were obscured. He did not speak when they entered. He did not look at them. He flinched from their touch, cowering away from the first human contact he had experienced in months. One official, Laurent, described what he found. A child so covered in vermin that they formed a moving layer on his skin. A child whose body was a mass of wounds and infections. A child who had forgotten how to speak, who responded to questions with animal sounds or silence, who seemed not to understand that the men in his room were there to help. The new government, appalled by what they found, tried to undo some of the damage. They assigned physicians to care for the child. They cleaned his room, changed his bedding, gave him fresh clothes. They tried to talk to him, to coax him back to something resembling humanity. It was far too late. The tuberculosis that had taken root during his abandonment was spreading through his bones. His legs would never straighten. His mind, whatever remained of it, was damaged beyond recovery. The doctors who examined him reported that he seemed to have no will to live, that he responded to kindness with the same blank incomprehension with which he responded to everything else. In the accounts that survive from these final months, there are occasional glimpses of the child he had been. Sometimes he would respond to music, his eyes showing a flicker of something like recognition. Sometimes he would whisper words, fragments of prayers, his mother's name. That suggested memories buried beneath the damage. One physician, trying to determine the extent of his cognitive function, asked him what he wished for. The child reportedly answered after a long silence, "I wish to die." He got his wish on June 8, 1795. He was 10 years and 2 months old. The death was quiet. There were no crowds, no guillotine, no grand revolutionary theater. Just a child, lying in a bed in a tower, finally escaping the prison his life had become. The physicians who attended him reported that he went peacefully, slipping from unconsciousness into death without apparent pain. After he died, a doctor named Philippe Jean Pelletan performed an autopsy. He confirmed what everyone already knew: tuberculosis of the bones and lungs, severe malnutrition, the accumulated damage of years of abuse and neglect. The official cause of death was listed as scrofula, a tubercular infection of the lymph nodes. But the official cause of death was a lie, or at least a profound understatement. Louis Charles did not die of tuberculosis. He died of what was done to him. He died of separation and abuse and abandonment. He died of being locked in a room and forgotten. He died because the revolution decided that a child was a symbol, and symbols can be destroyed without moral consequence. During the autopsy, Pelletan did something that would have profound consequences for the next 2 centuries. He secretly removed the child's heart, preserving it in a crystal urn. It was a common practice of the era, this preservation of organs as relics. But Pelletan was taking an extraordinary risk. The revolutionaries who had killed the king and queen would not have approved of preserving their son's heart like a sacred object. Pelletan kept the heart hidden for years. After his death, it passed through many hands, was stolen and recovered multiple times, and became an object of royalist veneration. In 2000, DNA testing confirmed that it was authentic, the heart of Louis XVI, matching the genetic profile of Marie Antoinette's hair. In 2004, the heart was finally interred at Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French kings. It took over 200 years for the child to join his family in death. On the floor above the room where Louis Charles died, his sister Marie-Therese was still a prisoner. She was 17 years old in June 795, and she had been confined to the temple for nearly 3 years. She had lost her father, her mother, her aunt, Madame Elizabeth, guillotined in May 794, and now her brother. She was the last surviving member of the immediate royal family. Marie-Therese did not know her brother had died. The revolutionary authorities, in a final act of casual cruelty, did not inform her. She continued to exist in her cell, alone, wondering what had become of the little boy she had helped raise. The brother who had been torn from their mother's arms 2 years before. She had heard him crying through the floor in the early days after the separation. Then she had heard his voice, changed and coarsened by Simon's tutelage. And then, at some point, she had heard nothing at all, just silence from the floor below. She would not learn of her brother's death until months later, after she had finally been released. The information came casually, almost as an afterthought. By then, he had been dead and buried for so long that there was no grave for her to visit, no funeral she could have attended, no opportunity to say goodbye. Marie-Thérèse survived. She was released in December 1795, exchanged for French prisoners held by Austria. She was sent to Vienna, where her mother's family received her with a mixture of sympathy and political calculation. She would eventually marry her cousin, the Duke of Angoulême, and live until 1851, long enough to see France cycle through another revolution, an empire, a restoration, and another monarchy. She never spoke publicly about what happened to her brother. In her memoirs, which she wrote years later, she recounted the events at the temple with remarkable restraint, focusing on dates and facts rather than emotions. She did not describe the sound of her brother crying through the floor. She did not describe what it felt like to know he was below her, suffering, and to be unable to help. Some silences are too deep for words. Marie-Thérèse carried hers for 56 years. The death of Louis Charles should have ended the story of Louis XVI, but history is rarely so clean. Within years of his death, rumors began to circulate that the boy in the temple had not been the real Dauphin, that somehow, at some point, a substitution had been made, and the true heir to the throne had escaped to live in hiding. These rumors were, on one level, obviously false. Multiple people had seen Louis Charles throughout his imprisonment. The continuity of his identity was well documented. The physicians who attended his death, who performed the autopsy, had no doubt they were dealing with the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. But on another level, the rumors made a kind of psychological sense. The truth of what happened to Louis Charles was so terrible, so completely at odds with any notion of justice or meaning, that many people simply could not accept it. It was easier to believe that he had escaped, that he was alive somewhere, that the story had a secret, happy ending. The alternative, that a child had been tortured to death by a republic founded on the rights of man, was too much to bear. Over the decades that followed, more than 100 men came forward claiming to be the lost Dauphin. They came from Germany, from America, from across Europe. Some were obvious frauds, in it for money or attention. Others may have genuinely believed their own claims. Men whose uncertain origins and fragmentary memories allowed them to construct identities around the greatest orphan story in Europe. The most famous of these pretenders was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a German clockmaker who appeared in the 1830s claiming to be Louis XVI. His case was more compelling than most. He knew details about the royal family that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. He convinced several people who had known the real Dauphin that he was genuine. He even convinced some members of the Bourbon family who accepted him as their lost relative. Naundorf fought legal battles for recognition until his death in 1845. He is buried in the Netherlands under the name Louis XVI, King of France. His descendants, to this day, maintain that he was the true Dauphin and that the child who died in the temple was a substitute. But DNA testing has definitively answered the question. The heart preserved by Dr. Pelletin matches the genetic profile of Marie Antoinette. The child who died in the temple was Louis Charles, son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. There was no escape, no substitution, no secret happy ending. The pretenders, all of them, were wrong. The boy died in that room, alone, having been systematically destroyed by the people who imprisoned him. That is the only ending there ever was. Who was responsible for what happened to Louis Charles? The easy answer is Antoine Simon, the brutal cobbler who beat and degraded him. Simon was undoubtedly cruel, undoubtedly a willing instrument of the child's destruction. He died on the guillotine himself, during the Thermidorian reaction, executed for his association with the radical faction that had fallen from power. There is a certain poetic justice in that, though justice seems too small a word for what was owed. But Simon was only a tool. He was chosen for his cruelty, directed in his methods, supported by a system that made his abuse possible. The real responsibility lies elsewhere, with the Committee of Public Safety that ordered the separation, with the revolutionary tribunals that used a child as a weapon against his mother, with the ideology that could look at an 8-year-old boy and see only a symbol to be destroyed. The French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, fraternity. It produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It inspired democratic movements across the world and genuinely improved the lives of millions by dismantling the structures of feudal oppression. These achievements were real, and they matter. But the revolution also produced the terror. It killed tens of thousands of people, many of them innocent of any crime. It created a system in which denunciation was rewarded and mercy was dangerous. It established the precedent, followed by so many revolutionary movements since, that ideological ends can justify any means, that enemies of the people are not really people at all. Louis Charles was not guillotined. He does not appear in the statistics of the terror's victims. His death was quieter, slower, more personal. But it was just as much a product of revolutionary logic. He was killed because he represented something the revolution hated. He was killed because his blood was wrong. His birth was wrong. His very existence was an offense to the new order. He was killed, ultimately, for the same reason his father and mother were killed. Because symbols must be destroyed, and children can be symbols too. The men who locked an 8-year-old in a room and abandoned him to rot did not think of themselves as monsters. They thought of themselves as builders of a better world. They were creating a republic of virtue, sweeping away the corrupt remnants of tyranny, establishing a society based on reason rather than superstition, equality rather than hereditary privilege. These were noble goals. Many of the revolutionaries were genuinely good people, genuinely committed to human welfare, genuinely believing that their cause justified any sacrifice. But the sacrifice they demanded included a child, and the ease with which they made that demand, the lack of hesitation with which they destroyed a little boy, tells us something about the danger of certainty. When you are absolutely sure that you are right, when your cause is so just that any opposition must be evil, when your enemies are symbols rather than people, then there is nothing you cannot justify. Not even the torture of children, not even the slow murder of a 10-year-old in a darkened room. This is the revolution's shadow, the darkness that accompanies its light. We can acknowledge the genuine achievements of 1789 while also acknowledging what was done to Louis Charles. We can celebrate the end of feudal privilege while also mourning the boy who died in the temple. History is large enough to hold both truths, but we should not forget either one. We should not let the grandeur of revolutionary ideals obscure the small body in the dirty bed. We should not let the passage of time turn horror into footnote. A child was destroyed. It matters. It will always matter. Somewhere in Paris there was once a room. It was a room in a tower in a fortress called the Temple. The fortress is gone now. Napoleon ordered it demolished in 1808 because royalists kept coming to mourn at the sight of the royal family's imprisonment. He wanted to erase the memory, to remove the shrine, to make Paris forget what had happened there. But before the walls came down, there was a room. It had stone walls and a narrow window that was eventually boarded over. It had a cot that was not changed for months at a time. It had a grate through which food was passed without words. It had shadows that grew longer as the seasons turned. Darkness that became the only constant in a small life that was ending. In that room, a child sat alone for 6 months. He had no toys. He had no voice to speak to, no face to see, no hand to hold. He had only the walls, the silence, the slow dissolution of everything he had ever been, the pain. We do not know what he thought during those months. We cannot know. The damage to his mind was so severe that by the time anyone came to check on him, he could barely communicate at all. But we can imagine the outlines of his suffering. We can imagine the terror of the first days, the screaming that brought no response. We can imagine the gradual fading of hope, the retreat into a smaller and smaller world. We can imagine the moment. There must have been a moment when he stopped believing anyone would come. He was 8 years old when they locked him in. He was 9 when they finally opened the door. In between, a year of his life disappeared into darkness, a year in which a child became something else, something broken, something waiting to die. The men who did this were not monsters in any obvious sense. They were revolutionaries, idealists, believers in a better world. They thought they were sweeping away the corrupt remnants of tyranny. They thought they were building a republic of virtue. They thought, if they thought about the child at all, that he was an acceptable sacrifice, a small price to pay for the liberation of humanity. But here's what they actually did. They took a little boy from his mother's arms. They gave him to a man who beat him and made him drink alcohol. They forced him to denounce his parents in terms he probably didn't understand. They used his testimony to send his mother to the guillotine. They locked him in a room and forgot about him. They let him rot in his own filth until his body was covered in sores and his mind was gone. And when he finally died, they buried him in an unmarked grave and tried to pretend it had never happened. This is what ideology can do when it loses sight of humanity. This is what happens when people become symbols, when children become abstractions, when political goals become more important than the suffering of individuals. The revolution was not unique in this. Every era has its versions of the temple, its children sacrificed to adult purposes. But the revolution gave us a particularly clear example, a particularly well-documented case. A child whose destruction we can trace step by step from the gardens of Versailles to the darkened cell. Marie Therese survived to old age, carrying the memory of her brother. She never spoke of him publicly. She raised no monuments, wrote no memoirs of his suffering. Perhaps she could not bear to revisit those years. Perhaps she had learned in the temple that some things cannot be shared, only endured. But she kept his memory. In 1851, as she lay dying, she was heard to murmur her brother's name. 56 years after his death, he was still with her. He would always be with her. It was stolen, recovered, lost, found, venerated as a relic, dismissed as a fraud. In 2000, DNA testing finally confirmed what it was: the heart of Louis Charles, the last Dauphin of France. In 2004, that heart was finally interred at Saint-Denis, the ancient burial place of French kings. A ceremony was held. Prayers were said. After 2009 years, the child was reunited with his family. It was a small measure of peace, this belated burial. It could not undo what had been done. It could not give back the years of suffering, the stolen childhood, the terrible death. But it acknowledged something, that Louis Charles had existed, that he had mattered, that his suffering deserved to be remembered. And perhaps that is all we can do now, 2 centuries later. We cannot save him. We cannot go back and unlock the door, clean the room, hold the child, tell him that someone cares. The room is gone. The tower is gone. Everyone who knew him is gone. But we can remember. We can tell his story, unflinching and complete, without softening the horror or pretending there was meaning in his suffering. We can refuse to let him become a footnote, a casualty statistic, an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice. He was Louis Charles. He was born a prince and died a prisoner. He was loved by his mother and destroyed by his country. He was 10 years old. In the end, that is what matters most. Not the politics, not the ideology, not the grand sweep of history, just this. There was a child. He suffered. He died. And he deserved better. They all deserve better. Every child who has ever been sacrificed to adult purposes, every innocent caught in the machinery of power, every small life extinguished because someone decided it was acceptable collateral damage, they all deserved better. We cannot save the dead, but we can remember them. We can refuse to look away from what was done. We can insist that children are not symbols, that suffering is not acceptable, that ideology must never become more important than the small, vulnerable humans in its place. It is what we have. And so we remember. In the silence after the story ends, and the darkness that settles when the telling is done, we remember a boy who died alone in a cell in Paris. We remember his golden hair and his blue eyes and his smile that charmed everyone who met him. We remember his mother's embrace and his father's lessons in the gardens of Versailles where he once played. We remember that he was real, that he lived, that he mattered, and we remember that he was 10 years old. So before you settle in and let the shadows of this story envelop you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Do so only if you genuinely find value in these journeys into the past and wish to delve deeper with us. And do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always a privilege to know who is joining us from around the world to explore these darker chapters of history. Until next time, this has been Dark Histories. Remember, the past is never truly past. It lives in the stories we tell, the lessons we refuse to learn, and the children we fail to protect. Guard them.